Well, we knew it was going to be bad because there's so much time on full throttle. So what was going to happen if you throw the 2026 Formula One power unit regulations at the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa? I feel very sorry for the track, actually, as an entity. And I guess for the crowd, I don't know whether they're exposed to it or not, but when you're on board and you're looking at the telemetry, it is just, well, it's just so sad. It's so sad to see Red Bull actually, because of the deployment requirement, coming out of the power, going into Eau Rouge. So Eau Rouge is completely watered down now. Into Pouin, the whole thing about Pouin is the unbelievable speed you pick up out of the previous left-hander down the hill, and then going into Pouin, it's a major drama as to actually how quick you can go. Can you lift? Can you not? But now they're sitting there on revs, and get this, Max Verstappen 20 kilometers an hour slower than Kimi Antonelli going into Pouin. I mean, that alone is a headline. Normally would be a headline, but of course isn't, because it's all about deployment. And then coming out of Pouin, this probably says a lot about Max, actually. It's probably unfair to say that against Kimi, but he's 26 kilometers an hour quicker than Kimi out of Pouin. 20 kilometers an hour slower going in, 12 miles an hour, 26 faster coming out. And then they go up the hill. And it's so sad to see them just sort of slowing down. They're doing 310 or something up the hill there, slowing down before the chicane. I mean, everything's gone from Spa, as we knew it would. But there's no point in saying, well, we knew it would, so therefore we won't talk about it, because this is one of the world's great circuits with some great corners. And right now I'm really scratching to see where those great corners are. It was just a day where everybody was talking about deployment, energy management, performance, power unit, this. There was nothing about, I mean, there was nothing about Eau Rouge. There was nothing about Pouin. There was nothing about going up the hill, Blanchimont. All of it was about that. And that is such a shame. It is such a shame. And I know what the answer will be from Formula One. Well, get rid of Spa, probably. It doesn't fit in with us. Well, that's a great shame, because Spa has so much history and it's such a great circuit. So that's how I'm. There's another thing as well before you go. Well, Windsor's had his say. There's another thing. I don't know how many people were watching Max's second practice start at the end of FP2. I think probably the world feed cameras had long since disappeared, and they were doing all their stand-up stuff in the pit lane or whatever. But his second start. Well, here's the news. Max Verstappen's second practice start, 2 burnouts, pull up, go on the clean side of the grid. Or was it that? Anyway, it was the right-hand side. And but the thing just bogged down. He almost stalled and just sort of chuddered away towards Eau Rouge. He got on the radio and just said, "What happened there?" And there was no reply. And then the whole thing was cut off. So I don't know. I mean, why are that we even have to be talking about this rubbish instead of how brilliant it is to see Formula One cars at Spa again? It's just, I keep saying, it's just so sad. Interesting to see a few of the teams, McLaren, Mercedes, bringing smaller rear wings to Spa. First time we've seen in this new regulation this year, teams going to smaller rear wings. We saw, because we didn't think maybe that was going to happen anymore, but we saw obviously larger rear wings for Monaco, but not smaller, certainly not smaller for Canada. But here they are running smaller rear wings, and I suspect that's because Monza's coming up as well. So I suppose from a budget cap situation, it makes sense to justify that. So that's quite interesting. The track it rained last night. There was a little bit of rain today. So the track was quite green. And so FP1 was okay. It was all about deployment. Max was actually quickest, which I suppose says something, doesn't it? That when the track doesn't have a lot of grip, and it is a little bit about just finding the grip that's there and doing the job, Max and Red Bull still right there. But the second session, the grip started to be obvious. It was less green. It still wasn't 100% quick. And Kimi Antonelli immediately showed his pace in the Mercedes at the expense again of George Russell, who looks, about where he's been ever since Canada, really. Or was it? No, since Miami. And so Kimi again looking very, very strong around Spa. But yes, should we be talking about? Interesting to see how Mercedes are deploying their power compared with Red Bull. I suppose that's significant. I mean, Red Bull do seem to be losing going into Eau Rouge with their engine management, deployment, power, and that's obviously hurting them up the hill. They're not very quick in sector one. But then again, normally you would say sector two is where Red Bull would be quick, and Max is pretty quick sector two, and he's not bad sector three, which suggests that they're running a little bit more downforce, I guess, than McLaren and Ferrari. Ferrari, not bad, not bad, there or thereabouts, about where they look on Fridays these days. In terms of deployment, how we have to judge things at the moment, they look pretty similar to Red Bull and McLaren. Lewis able to get on the power sooner out of Eau Rouge than Max, which is an interesting thing, isn't it? And I wonder whether Red Bull, obviously they don't have the same efficient downforce as Mercedes, nobody does. But I wonder whether because they're running lower to get the grip they've got in sector two, because they are quite good in sector two, and as a result, it's not working for them through Eau Rouge. Maybe there's some of that. That's what they used to do, I think, even before the power deployment days. But Ferrari not looking too bad. Lewis looking good in the car. Charles didn't really get a comfortable run, typical Friday for Charles, but all three of them different in their deployment from Mercedes, which just shows that how good the Mercedes is really, and not only in terms of how good the chassis is, and we've talked a lot about that, but how good they are in terms of managing the engine, harvesting the power, deploying the power. And a good example of that was Lando Norris, who was pretty similar on his lap, and his quickest lap in FP2 to Kimi Antonelli in the Mercedes, until he got to the back end of the lap, and then he was just sitting there with seemingly with no power, whereas Kimi's still got power up to the chicane. And again, that's nothing to do with driver skill, absolutely nothing whatsoever. What you could say is, at least McLaren have no excuse really, because they are using the same power unit as Mercedes. But obviously in this era, being a customer is a bit more of a problem than it was in the previous era, partly because how you manage the electrical side of the engine is much more up to the team than well, obviously than the internal combustion engine side of it all. So I guess it's that, and you have to say, wow, isn't that great that Mercedes are doing that? But yeah, but it was kind of sad to see Lando just so slow on that last bit for no reason at all, other than that he just didn't have any power. The critical things you need for the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa. So sad to have to say that. Anyway, there we go. The other news is that Lando Norris has got a 10-place grid penalty because of engine power unit replacement, as has Lance Stroll's got some sort of penalty as well. Not that it matters. And Isaac Hadjar, which is more significant, of course, because he again today he looked very good alongside Max, just a shade slower, but doing a great job. Has also got to start from the back with a lot of PU replacements. This is the first time we've seen all that starting to come in. Another very boring aspect of Formula One, when we have all these ridiculous things. As I said, when it's a power unit thing, it's nothing to do with the driver. And it's such a shame that Lando Norris has to go into this race knowing he's got a 10-place grid penalty, or in Isaac's case, that he's starting from the back of the grid. I've said that a million times, and I'm saying it should be more of a penalty for the team, the power unit supplier, perhaps, but not so much for the driver. But it does penalise the driver more than anything. Mind you, Max has got his own penalty, which is getting the thing off the line anyway. So it'll be interesting to see who's ahead going into the first corner. Isaac Hadjar or Max Verstappen? No, I shouldn't be making jokes like that. Anyway, yeah, so Max obviously brought the crowd to its feet with his speed in the morning, which was good. In the afternoon, everybody was out. Most people would in the beginning or had started fuel runs. And everybody it's so difficult to judge the fuel runs because of all the power management stuff. Very, very, very difficult to compare top speeds. Nothing makes sense anymore, in my opinion. And that was curtailed by Pierre Gasly going off. Unusual place really in the sort of Stavelot chicane S's between turns 13 and 14, hitting the barrier. He just sort of got on the gravel and then sideswiped the rear on a bit of projecting barrier, and of course that did quite a lot of damage. And he had but Colapinto looking very good in the Alpine as well, so that won't have done that team any good. But Pierre Gasly, to his credit, is putting together a really good charity foundation around Antoine Hubert, who obviously we know lost his life in 2019. Very, very sad accident, and on top of that, in 2023, Delano Vantoff. So there was all the drivers were out there. The team's charity run on the Thursday. Good to see that. Made me think, actually, well, it obviously makes you think of how many lives we've lost at Spa. And here I was at the beginning of this video extolling the virtues of this great circuit, but we've always known, I guess, just as we knew about the power unit dramas this year, we've always known how dangerous Spa is as a circuit, particularly when it rains. But it made me think, I don't know why, but it made me think, I think it was more Delano's accident, made me think of Ian Taylor, who we don't talk about much. Very, very good British driver who was good in right up to the Formula 3 level, and then did a brilliant job for British Motorsport with the Ian Taylor Motor Racing School at Thruxton for many years, and just needlessly, it was just an accident in the wet. I think he was in a Rover touring car support race, and I think he was T-boned on the straight there after Eau Rouge in the wet, and we lost Ian as well. So I'd just like to mention his name as a driver that I miss a lot. Very talented, lovely guy too, very, very good bloke. But we lost so many drivers at Spa. We're not going to go down that road at this point. I think it's more just see what happens tomorrow. That in theory there's going to be no more rain. The track will pick up grip, and we'll have a better feel, I guess, for how the teams are approaching it with their power units and their management systems. And more unreliability, though, for Oscar Piastri on this occasion, hydraulic leak, which in FP1, back end of FP1, which caused, as a result, the gearbox had to be changed. So it was quite a big drama, and that obviously cost him quite a lot of time as well. So unreliability still there in this new regulation. All the talk is about energy deployment around Spa rather than, I can remember following Michael up the steps from the Spa paddock back up to the pits. They're quite heavy, steep steps, and he was running up two at a time, and I was kind of trying to stay with him. And I remember it was wet, and I was thinking, I don't want to lose my footing here. Michael was just like that. But I said to him, Michael, so what's Pouin like going into Pouin? And he just stopped. He turned around and looked at me, and he said, "Oh, nice," and just kept going. But I don't know if you can have those conversations now, because what is Pouin like? Well, it'll all be about what the energy deployment's like going into Pouin. And they just go down the hill. As I say, the whole thing about Pouin is the rush you get and the speed build up going into Pouin. The entry speed's probably about the same, but because there's no build up of speed before that, it's just like, and it just takes everything away from the corner. And it's the same up the hill. And it's the same for the Red Bull guys going through Eau Rouge. I don't know. So anyway, that's Friday at Spa. We'll see what happens tomorrow. I guess we shouldn't be too negative. Other than to say that I noticed that in the Open, Justin Rose is really having his first big event with the McLaren golf clubs. Orange bag he's got now. As I speak, doesn't look as if he's going to make the cut either. I don't know if that's an omen or what. Probably not. Anyway, take care. See you tomorrow. And so they line up on the grid for the Belgian Grand Prix tomorrow at Spa, pretty much in the form of the pace we saw on Friday. That's Max Verstappen and Kimi Antonelli ahead of the field. Kimi on the pole, Max just next to him in the Red Bull, benefiting, he said, and quite visually, from a tow he got from Isaac Hadjar on his last quick lap in Q3. We'll get onto that in a second. But Kimi taking the pole, which was significant for two things. One, yet another layer on these incredible building blocks that he has this year, showing how good he is, how good he's becoming virtually by the race. Yes, it's another fast circuit like Silverstone. No, it is not the same as Silverstone in that Silverstone has these distinct phases of the lap, whereas Spa is more flowing, some very, very fast long corners at Spa. And a bit like Silverstone, going into it, you would have said George Russell territory. Spa, you would definitely go into this race saying, yeah, George Russell in the palm of his hand, in a car as good as the Mercedes this year. And yet he was blown away by Kimi to the tune of half a second. Now, there are mitigating circumstances, I'm sure, and George for sure will be talking about those, has been speaking about those, and we'll have a look at the difference between the two on their laps. But it's just incredible, isn't it? How this young Italian is constantly showing it to George Russell, who's starting to look a little bit spooked. Yep, it could all still change and many things can happen, but there were no yellow flags in the dying moments of qualifying in Spa. There were no other mitigating circumstances. It was a straight fight. And so when your gauge is a teammate like George, that is as big as getting the pole in itself. Lando Norris qualified third for McLaren Mercedes, but will start with a 10-place grid penalty. And that means that P3 will go to George Russell, who will start behind Kimi on the grid, with Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton fourth and fifth for Ferrari. Right, going back to the laps. First of all, Kimi versus George. There's no doubt Kimi, for whatever reason, was quicker in the last sector and seemed to be quicker up the hill through the Blanchimard section. But it's so difficult to judge that because none of the cars are going at real speed through there. They're all throttling back, lifting, coasting, whatever they're doing, harvesting power for the run out of the chicane up to the start finish line at the end of the lap. And yes, there was a big difference there through the Blanchimard kink, exactly in the middle of it. George, 288 kilometers an hour, not quick at all. Kimi Antonelli, 296. So there's a big difference there. Now, whether that's because he's done a better job of using less power in sectors 2 and 1 and therefore has more power towards the end of the lap, or whether there was a real engine problem with George, very difficult to say. Mercedes won't say. George probably just feels he didn't have any power in the last sector. But let's have a look then at what happened in sector 2. Well, let's have a look then at what happened actually in sector 1. And if you take the speed at which they came out of Eau Rouge at the top of the hill, George Russell doing 3.21 there, Kimi Antonelli 3.28 at exactly the same place on their quickest lap at the exit of Eau Rouge. That tells you something. Now, George will say, well, I was basically flat through there anyway, so that's got to be power. But is it? I mean, obviously, we do know that keeping a car square on the road and getting a transition at exactly the right moment takes load out of the car, takes load out of the engine. So there's a question mark. In the middle of the straight, they're both throttling back to 3.16, unbelievably slow. And then we get to some interesting corners, like the entry to Pouin, the very, very fast downhill left-hander about which I've been eulogizing since the live stream, but obviously very disappointed to see that it's not approached by anything like the right speed anymore. But anyway, at that point, the entry to Pouin, Kimi Antonelli 274, George Russell 277. So that you'd say, wow, George really quick there. But look at this exit. Kimi Antonelli 267 on exit of Pouin. George Russell 264. Now that's nothing to do with power. That's just to do with the way you're using the car. And Kimi obviously setting the car up for a perfect exit, whereas George is going in really quick, probably scrubbing off a bit of speed, probably got more load. And when he's getting onto the power again, such as it is, he's actually losing 3 kilometers an hour there. So that's nothing to do with power differences. That's to do with stylistic differences. Turn 13, which is the Stavelot right-hander, after which, again, we saw other drivers today. Lando Norris lost a bit of time there in Q1, and also Lewis Hamilton had a shunt there, a bit like Pierre Gasly's shunt coming out of that section in FP3 today. Hit the same protruding piece of barrier that Pierre hit, but didn't have quite the same shunt, but just demolished the right rear. He wanted to drive the car back to the pits. They kept saying, no, Lewis, park it. Nah, slow down, I can bring it back. It was right at the end of FP3 anyway, so I don't know what Lewis's rush was. But anyway, that was interesting. It's interesting, I think, if you look at that corner, which is the left-hander exit of the Stavelot section, which is obviously, with these cars, has become a bit of a place for change of direction and making sure you're not coming out with too much load on the rear of the car. And Lewis leaning on the back more than Charles, and Lando Norris, as we know, wide corner entries, relatively wide compared with, say, Max or Kimi leaning on the rear, and Pierre Gasly also yesterday, about the same as Lando, all of them losing the back there and going into that extended bit of arm curve. So a bit of a pattern there. Interesting. Anyway, getting back to that point, turn 13, which is the right-hander going into that. Kimi Antonelli, 200 kilometers an hour. George Russell, 196. Again, I wouldn't have said that's a power difference. I would have said that that's Kimi confident of what he can do with a change of direction. But then on the exit of Stavelot, which I don't mean that left-hander, I mean by the time they've gone into the long right, starting to go up the hill, George Russell, who apparently has got less power than Kimi, 277. Kimi 271. So interesting. Blanchimard, as I say, Kimi's either throttling back less and he's having to harvest less power, but he's doing 296, as I say, compared with George 288 there. So that was that. I think all marks, full marks then, all credit to Kimi Antonelli and the lap he's putting together around Spa and the way he managed qualifying as well. You probably noticed the light changing a bit. It's because I'm actually doing this in a slightly different place because of the heat in the studio today in Spain. Anyway, that's another thing. Yeah, Kimi planned it well. The track did change from yesterday. It picked up grip. And in Q1, Kimi wasn't that quick. He was slower, for example, than nothing wrong with this. No shame, not shame in it at all, but because he was really quick. But he was slower than Arvid Lindblad, for example, in Q1. But he was very calm. They just got the car set up for Q2, changed a bit of flap, and away he went. And pole position really never looked as if it belonged to anybody else today, although Max pushed him hard. Now let's get on to Max, and we can talk through about the same parts of the lap for Max's quickest lap as well. So going to Pool, Max, as per yesterday, not that quick, 267 compared with Kimi 274. But then coming out of Pool, Max 280, Kimi 267. Max did to Kimi what Kimi did to George through Pool. Just phenomenal exit from Pool. And then turn 13, Max about the same as Kimi 298. Kimi 200, George 196. Exit of Stabilo 274 Max, 271 Kimi, 277 George, so about the same. And then at the Blanchiment kink, the left-hander going up the hill, he's right behind Isaac Hadjar getting his toe. He's doing 300 kilometers an hour there, which obviously does make a difference. But let's just talk about that. And first of all, full marks to Isaac for getting it timed absolutely perfectly. He was actually slow. He was in front of Max, obviously, as they went out. And he was just sort of, they timed it perfectly with Red Bull, with the radio and how many seconds Max was behind him. So that when they started to go up the hill, Isaac had slowed down, waited as he saw Max catching him. And then Max was right on him as they went through Blanchiment and then just pulled out perfectly. You could almost argue they left it a little bit too tight, but I think he did it absolutely perfectly. They had a sort of trial run in the first run in Q3, and it was great to see them doing that. And great that Max thanked him. First thing he did was thanked him for that, saying, "Oh, without that, I would have been P6." So let's get on to that one now, because I think Max there is being a little bit bashful. Because if you look at his first run, when he didn't really benefit from a toe, well, he didn't benefit from a toe in Q3, compared with his second run in Q3, and it was obviously going quicker. Everything was perfect for that last run. Sector 1, Max was 0.077 quicker. Sector 2, 0.135 quicker. And Sector 3, when he got the toe, 0.094 quicker. Now, of course, it's not as simple as that, because if Red Bull had planned for that, which obviously they had, then they probably would have run the car a little bit lower than if they didn't know Max was going to get the toe, if you see what I mean. So maybe he wouldn't have been as quick in Sector 2. But it just shows overall planning. And it's all because Isaac has got this grid penalty because of the power unit changes at the back of the grid anyway. So there was no drama there. Although I do wonder, in this situation, let's say if Charles had an engine change and was starting from the back of the grid, and they said, "Oh, can you give a toe to Lewis?" Do you think he would have done it? Or vice versa? Do you think Oscar would have done that for Lando in that situation? And do you think George would have done that for Kimi in that situation? Maybe not. And I think this actually highlights again the logic of having a driver lineup like Verstappen, Hadjar. Hadjar's quick enough to win races. He's quick enough to be on the podium. He's very, very good. But ultimately, everybody knows that Max is boss. That's not the case. That wasn't the case last year, obviously, at McLaren. It's not the case at Mercedes, quite obviously. Confusion reigns in that area. And then you got the whole thing at Ferrari, all the dynamic at Ferrari. So, yeah, I think, it just showed what a good job Red Bull have done with that. Very, very good. And the other thing I thought, just going back to Kimi actually, and the way he ran the day, and I should point out here, again, there was lots of weird things going on with gears. And whereas Max would be in 8th on that last run, you'd imagine from Blanchiment up to the chicane, you'd imagine he'd be in 8th gear. They always have been Formula One cars at Spa. And yet, as they go through Blanchiment, the two Mercedes drivers are going from 8th back to 7th and carrying 7th all the way up to the chicane, which is obviously an energy harvesting area. Well, it is for everybody, but they feel they're just getting more out of the engine, the power unit, by doing that and going back to 7th. And then, but there was an interesting incident, and I can't remember the last time a driver actually admitted to this, and or it even happened. But it was Kimi starting a lap towards the end of FP3, and before Lewis hit the wall and brought the red flag out. But it was Kimi going into La Source from seventh down to first, and just running wide out of La Source, and then getting on the radio saying, "Oh, I've had to abort the lap because I didn't get down to first gear in time." And it was interesting when they were telling Max to go to stay in eighth. They made the point of saying to him, "So make sure," and to Lando actually, they did the same thing with Lando. Make sure that you therefore start changing down sooner because you've got a lot of gears to go through. Made me think of what this would be like, this era, this 2026 power unit era, if we still had manual downshifts, 8 speed, double H pattern manual downshift, heel and towing required. It would definitely get everybody's attention, I think, wouldn't it? So we go through the grid very quickly, and then bearing in mind Lando, who did actually qualify third, will be starting P11. So George Russell, P3 in the other Mercedes. You won't be happy about that, but he will be happy about being near Kimi on the grid, and maybe anything can happen from his point of view. It looks like a one-stop strategy. Although, as Pirelli pointed out yesterday, it was quite interesting to see how many teams have kept 2 new sets of hard tires in the garage for the race, which I guess is everybody trying to second guess everybody else by having a second new set in case there's some sort of safety car or neutralization, as they like to call it, at some stage of the race. So it'll be a one-stopper, but obviously it may not be, bearing in mind neutralization. Charles Leclerc will start fourth in the other Ferrari ahead of Lewis. Yeah, Charles just did a good job. I mean, again, I said yesterday it was a typical Friday for Charles, and guess what happened? It was a typical Saturday for Charles. He looked beautiful in the car, drove really well. And I think Lewis, possibly after that shunt in FP3, it was kind of hard whack. Nothing to do with him, no damage physically, obviously, but it was a mistake, an unusual mistake for Lewis to make on a Saturday of a Grand Prix, just sort of running wide and hitting the rear like that. It might have clipped his wings a little bit in terms of, I just need to keep this thing on the island and get a very good job. Anyway, he did that, and the difference in the end was very small, so still be very happy with that. Oscar Piastri, very disappointing, P7 in the other McLaren Mercedes. I mean, if ever there was a weekend where Oscar should be up there doing what Lando's doing, i.e. qualifying top 3, it would have been Spa, last year's winner. And yet there he is, very unimpressive in the other McLaren. He's almost as spooked as George Russell, it would appear, although no reason for Oscar to be spooked about anything, really. So it's just bizarre. I suppose you could say it was interesting to see how well Lando was driving as well today. And maybe it was just like a pressure off, nothing to lose, enjoy myself. And the more he does that, the better he drives and the quicker he goes. Arvid Lindblad, mentioned already, very, very good P8. Always looks as if he's going to be up there running strongly in Q3. As did Gabriel Bortoleto in the Audi, very good. And Isaac Hadjar obviously will start at the back as well, leaving Liam Lawson P10 in the other V-Carb. And going back to the heading of unreliability of the current regulations, Isaac Hadjar lost all power this morning in FP3, lost time there. And remember, Lando Norris also had a problem. The good news, I suppose, was I only saw one practice start today from Max, but the good news was that he actually seemed to get it off the line. Didn't look that quick, but he got it off the line. So George Russell will be thinking, yeah, right, Max, think you're going to be second or first out of La Source? Forget about it. So that'll be an interesting one, watching George versus Max into La Source tomorrow, turn 1, probably, as the engineers like to call it. Pierre Gasly and Franco Colapinto, good job to make it easily into Q2 in the Alpines. Nico Hulkenberg also had a problem, constant unreliability of these new regs, which was a great shame. They shouldn't have changed anything from last year. Anyway, said that a million times. And those that didn't even get out of Q1, the 2 Aston Martins, were they there? Sergio Perez and Valtteri Bottas in the Cadillacs. Esteban Ocon, who's starting to look a little bit out of breath in the Haas, and Alex Albon in the Williams Mercedes. Carlos Sainz made it through to Q2, but doesn't look happy in that team, that car. And no doubt we'll be thinking more about the final of the World Cup than the Belgian Grand Prix, I would imagine. And just on that subject, apropos other sports, sadly, Justin Rose did not make the cut in the Open with his McLaren clubs. Interesting to see a golfer with McLaren logo on his shirt as well. Red Bull have got a deal in golf as well. They don't seem to be doing much with it. In fact, they don't seem to be doing anything with it at all. Anyway, that's another matter. Anyway, there we are. Big thanks to RSC Watches, to Track Ninja, to OEM Exclusive, and of course to Jetcraft. Apologies for the shadow and stuff, but anyway, it's been a bit of a more relaxed time for me, not quite as hot and sticky in the studio as it would have been, but I will be back there tomorrow, I promise, when we do the live chat for the Belgian Grand Prix, starting about half an hour before the race. The chat starts then, going through to the checkered flag, and looking forward to all your questions and comments. Looking forward to enjoying the race with you, by which I mean the channel members. So if you haven't joined, please click that join tab below the videos, and yeah, love to have you on board. Okay, big thanks, take care, see you tomorrow. Well, it was a motor race, you can say that. The overtaking, very, very suspect, most of it. When I say that, I mean any passes that were going under the heading of overtakes in a Grand Prix. A lot of it related, as we predicted, as everybody predicted, around this circuit called Spa. A lot of it related just to using the power well, deploying the power well, and one car just being quicker in a straight line suddenly than another. The race resulted in a, I've got to say, superb win for Kimi Antonelli, because there's always a human element, there's always an athletic element, always a racing driver element to every Grand Prix, regardless of the regulations. And Kimi was just brilliant throughout the day. Made a perfect start from the pole. Max got a good start as well in the Red Bull, bit of a surprise there, but was a good second in and out of La Source. But then, as we now know, got some sort of unexpected power surge going down the hill towards Eau Rouge, blasted past Kimi. Still had to have the commitment to do the pass into Eau Rouge, so there was a lot of skill involved there, a lot of commitment, as I say. And then they get to the Kimmel Straight, and Kimi just blasted past. So from that point onwards, Kimi was basically in charge, although he did come in earlier for tires. It was a one-stop race. All the top runners, with the exclusion of Lando Norris, who obviously wanted to gain positions, having got his 10-place grid penalty, who started on hards. Everybody else of note started on the medium and then went to the hard, one-stop strategy. Kimi stopped earlier than Charles Leclerc, and Charles benefited from that, because when he came in, it chimed in perfectly with the VSC, with a virtual safety car, which elevated Charles to the lead for a while. But Kimi, this is where I think Kimi drove with great maturity and great forethought, and that was just to drive within the car after everything that had happened at Silverstone and other races, not drive the car any quicker than he needed to in order to win the race at the right pace. And he did that, and he did his pass in the end with a nice power deployment move on the straight, on the Kimmel Straight. And thereafter didn't really thrash the car, didn't pull away, didn't set fastest lap with 2 laps to go or 1 lap to go. He just won at the slowest possible speed, which is absolutely correct thing to do, and got his win. And it was a massive win for him in terms of the championship, in terms of Mercedes, because George Russell didn't even finish the first lap. George inherited 3rd place, you'll recall, in qualifying, because Lando had that penalty, and made a pretty good start too. Max was outside him, so he let Max go out of La Source, and he filtered into 3rd place going into Eau Rouge. But then coming out of Eau Rouge, it all went completely wrong for George Russell in a way that I find, I have to confess, completely incomprehensible. Let me give you a snapshot of what everyone was doing in terms of top speed just before they touched the brakes at the end of the Kimmel Straight. So Kimi Antonelli, who's just used the toe from Max, and Max going very slowly as well because of that weird power deployment coming out of La Source, not giving him enough on the straight. Kimi Antonelli's doing 3:07, not very quick, actually. In other words, he's just basically come out and done the same speed that he was doing out of Eau Rouge, but Max is going slower, so it was an easy pass for him. Max Verstappen behind him, as I say, lacking power, 285, ridiculously slow. Then Charles Leclerc, 322, 322 kilometers an hour, compared with Kimi Antonelli, 307. Now, Charles Leclerc, Kimi was in a tow. Charles Leclerc for sure in a tow, because if anything, he was behind Max. Lewis Hamilton behind Charles, 329, having just passed George Russell who was doing 3:16. So the Mercedes, unbelievably slow on the Kimmel Straight on the first lap. Oscar Piastri underlining that 3:23 in the McLaren also got in front of George. So George came out of La Source in P3, and by the braking area going into Les Combes, he was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th. And it all happened on the Kimmel Straight. Now, that's not motor racing. That is, I don't know what that is. I mean, for sure, Ferrari do a very good job somehow with the battery storage on the formation lap, and both drivers had a lot of speed on the straight as a result. It looks like Mercedes lack a little bit in that area, as obviously do Red Bull in terms of where they can deploy the energy and doing it in the most efficient way. But the significant thing about all of that, and I've always talked about this going into these regulations, is the problem of speed differential on the straight. When I say problem, I usually use the word in the context of potential danger. But of course, there's another problem as well, which is that, and we see this a lot now, the cars have these unexpectedly slow or fast straight line bursts, as a result of which there's a bottleneck at the next corner, particularly if it's all happening on the opening lap. So there's George, who's just been passed by 4 cars on the straight on the opening lap, but he brakes really late and he's up alongside Lewis as they go into Les Combes. And what's he going to do? Is he just going to back away and give everybody room? No, of course, he's going to stay there. And he and Lewis tangled. And as a result of that, he was out of the race. Massive bonus points for Kimi Antonelli. And on top of that, it effectively resulted then in a penalty for Lewis Hamilton, who, in my view, did absolutely nothing wrong on this occasion. There was just a lot of cars, a lot of traffic, all because of the ridiculous speed differentials on the straight. And Lewis basically just held his line, but he got a 5-second penalty. Now, that's another story. We'll go into that now. We might as well. Lewis, as at Silverstone, was not told by the team that he had that 5-second penalty until just before the pit stop. So quite clearly, this has happened 2 races in a row now that they haven't told him. So quite clearly, it's an instruction from Lewis, I guess, to the team, or the team deciding that Lewis can't take it and he needs to focus on the race or something. Because on the lap they told him to box, he got straight back on the radio and said, I thought we were going to consult one another about this. My tires still feel great. Why are we boxing? And of course, they had to say, well, you got a 5-second penalty and we need to be very careful here what we're doing. As it happened, it coincided also with the VSC. So in some respects, it mitigated the damage. But the problem for Lewis was that he was stacked behind Charles Leclerc. And then in the panic of all of that, Ferrari failed to, they had to do the 5-second penalty thing. Then they failed to do a flap adjustment that Lewis wanted. And there was also a skirmish as he left with the mechanic who was going to do the wing adjustment, but didn't have time. And there was a lack of communication. And he fell over coming out as Lewis left the pits, as a result of which the team then got quite a significant fine, some of which was held, quite a significant fine for an unsafe release. All of that due to the ridiculous speed differentials caused by these 2026 Formula One engines on the opening lap on the Kimmel Straight. Now, if there's an explanation, I mean, further down the field, the cars are building up more speed. They're all in a tow. They're all in a pack. Some of them are doing 340. Pierre Gasly was doing 347 or something, compared with, and I repeat it, Kimi Antonelli 307. Not that they were near one another. Of course they weren't. But there's the differences in top speeds on that opening lap, and indeed on other laps of the race, was just absurd. Anyway, shortly after all that snapshot on the straight on the first lap, Charles Leclerc got Max, and it looked as if he was going to disappear, and Max was going to be vulnerable to Oscar Piastri, who was going quite well, to Lewis Hamilton, and it was going to be a struggle race for Red Bull. But then shortly after that, lap 6, Max blasts past Charles Leclerc on the straight as if Charles going backwards. And indeed he was, 3:16 compared to the 3:22 he'd been doing on the opening lap when he had slightly more fuel on the car. You tell me. I mean, it looks like Ferrari do a very good job, obviously with the starts, but they do a very good job with the battery storage on the formation lap. Looks like Mercedes don't do a very good job there. Or is it that they just don't want to deploy too much energy early in the race till they see what's going on? I mean, the races are now starting to be, the strategy and the overall feel of the race is being defined by all this deployment business. Is, well, confusing is actually putting it nicely, I think. Anyway, the result of all that was that Charles Leclerc came out in front because he got his pit stop with the virtual safety car. And as I say, Kimi chose his moment, really. Even though his tyres were a little bit older, his car was always better than a Ferrari. Indeed, the Mercedes was the best car around Belgium, and I think you could fairly say, without too much doubt, that had George actually just backed away from the whole thing, let everybody go and be very, very careful through Les Combes and kept going, he probably would have been second or third in this Grand Prix. The car was that good, even if he was starting from 10th at the end of the first lap. Anyway, Kimi made perfect use of the best racing car and won the Grand Prix, and now has a substantial lead in the World Championship. A substantial lead. But guess who's second now? As a result of George's retirement, Lewis Hamilton has actually moved up to second place in the World Championship. Good luck to him. I felt very sorry for him today because I think he drove very well, and yet it all went against him. Why they have this business of not telling him about the penalty, this is something that Ferrari need to get on top of. And if it's a Lewis thing, then I suppose they're never going to change it. But if it's not a Lewis thing, why has it happened 2 races in a row? And on top of that, obviously there was a lack of communication within the Ferrari garage about doing the wing adjustment, actually doing the 5-second thing, or compounding all these different factors going on. Probably most teams would have made some sort of error as well, but it was a big deal and they needed to get on top of that, or they do need to get on top of that. So Charles finished a very good second, and Max, I think, driver of the race, probably third in the Red Bull, had no right really to be on the podium in that car. Very, very good drive by Max, faultless drive. Lots of things he was complaining about during the race. The obviously going down to the deployment, and that was all over the place. Then he had a problem with the downshifts, as ever at Red Bull, even before the 26 regs. And then the car wasn't very good on hard tires either, which suggests that, again, it's just lacking in overall aero efficiency. But I think it was interesting that he was able to hold off Oscar Piastri, who did have some floor damage as a result of a coming together with Charles on the opening lap. But a floor damaged McLaren is still going to be a much better car than a Red Bull. But he beat Oscar Piastri. He obviously beat Lewis as well. And it's a fair bet that Max probably would have been second ahead of Charles Leclerc had Charles not benefited from the VSC. And one of the reasons, of course, that happened was because Max came in because his left front was starting to go off and they couldn't keep him out for too much longer. Charles Leclerc was almost on the point of overtaking Max, and at that moment they brought him in. And that was obviously, as it turned out, a little bit too early, because had he stayed out a bit longer, he too could have come in on the VSC. So it wasn't just that Ferrari were lucky, it was the way things went today for Max when he was driving the skin off the car without actually overstressing it, if you see what I mean. Just a fabulous drive. But I thought it was quite interesting with Max, because he'd made a point of saying after qualifying, you know, I owe this to Isaac Hadjar and the tow he gave me in sector 3. But I did make the point, I made the point yesterday, that I felt that Max had looked so good in sector 2, particularly in the way he was using the car, just what he was doing, his usual thing, just absolutely spot on. And I think so it proved, because he was that good sector 2, where all the decent corners are, that he was able to actually hold it quite well through sector 3 and actually respond to the team saying, look, if you can just use the power a little bit less through turn 15, we'll have more power for the rest of the lap. And he was able to do that. So as I suspected, I think Max was being a little bit bashful yesterday when he put all the glory on Isaac. He did a very good job to give him the tow, but nonetheless, it was Max as much as anything else that got that front row grid position yesterday in the Red Bull. And I think that was proved in the race today. Bear in mind that Red Bull were not running a smaller rear wing for Spa. As I said in the first video on Friday, McLaren and Mercedes both brought smaller chord wings for Spa. First time we've seen teams adapting to super fast circuits. They didn't do that in Canada, and I guess they'll have these wings now for Monza. But Red Bull didn't, for a simple reason, that they wanted to go back to the old wing after the drama at Silverstone with the Ferrari-like DRS system. They wanted to go back to the old DRS, and that didn't give them an opportunity then to do a smaller version of that original classic wing. So they were running with a relatively large rear wing, which also hurt them in a straight line. But Max was able to not use that. Max was able to drive around that and still finish on the podium. And Ferrari were the other team, of course, that didn't have a smaller rear wing, which makes it even more confusing when you look at Charles Leclerc's 3.22 on the Kimmel straight on the opening lap, Lewis Hamilton 3.29, Kimi Antonelli with a tow 3.07. So that is so strange. And it's not the only thing that's strange, you know, different gears, different places of the lap between two drivers in the same team, still a common theme. And so it goes on. Yeah, Lando Norris, I think it's quite easy to say in retrospect they should have brought Lando in when the safety car, when the virtual safety car was deployed, because yeah, it would have been a free pit stop in effect. But they didn't, because he started, as I say, on the hard tire, which was the logical thing for him to do. And I kind of get that. You know, he's going to pick up track position, obviously, with a little bit of from the VSC. And anyway, the point was with the stint, he was going to pick up track position and to run the stint as long as possible to make his tyres as fresh on the mediums as much as they could. In retrospect, I suspect when they look back at it, it would have been better for him to have brought them in and stacked him behind Oscar. But that was the other downside, of course, stacking him behind Oscar. So I think it's quite easy to criticize that. But equally, I think McLaren did a pretty good job with that car. I think Oscar, to me, was the more disappointing of the two, because I always imagined him. I think some people would agree with me here. He's a sort of Australian Fernando Alonso in the way he drives and his approach to racing. You know, he's just a pure racer. And, you know, show Fernando a little bit of floor damage or a little bit of front brake duct broken away, and he goes quicker. He certainly doesn't go any slower. And yet, the minute they told Oscar that he had that damage, it was like, oh, you know, I'll back away from this. And he never really looked threatening after that. Yes, he drove within the limits of the car that he had. And yes, of course, his tire deg was worse because of the floor damage. But I don't know. It was just an opportunity for Oscar at least to finish third in that race to beat Max. And especially Lewis, who of course had that 5-second penalty and the mayhem of that pit stop. As it was, he finished fifth. That's why I say I thought Lewis drove very well, never gave up. Very, very aggressive. Not aggressive, but just competitive in everything he was doing today. Looked very, very good. Oscar fifth. Isaac Hadjar, very good sixth from the back. Had started on the hard tire, came in under the safety car, went to the medium, and then back to the hard again. So that was quite a good strategy, and he did very well and finished sixth ahead of Lando, who was seventh. And then Gabriel Bortoleto, who drove really well in the Audi, won the midfield battle. It was and a lot of passing and a lot of aggressive racing there as well. But that finished in the order of Bortoleto in the Audi, Arvid Lindblad in the V-Carb, the two Alpines of Colapinto and Pierre Gasly, and then Liam Lawson in the other V-Carb, who no doubt will be delighted tonight that a Kiwi has just won the Open. Congratulations to Ryan Fox. Good moment. Mentioned that, I think, to Kiwis. So, yeah, that was the Belgian Grand Prix. Next weekend, this is a double header before the August break. Next weekend is the Hungarian Grand Prix, from the sublime to the ridiculous. I don't think Hungary is ridiculous, but it's certainly one extreme to the other. Very, very slow circuit relative to Spa. So a couple of interesting corners. And of course, the 2026 power units will look a lot more respectable around Hungary in terms of lift and coast, in terms of all the other things that we talk about endlessly, unfortunately, you know. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. So there we are. We look forward to the Hungarian Grand Prix. Big thanks to all the members that took part in the live chat today during the race. It was a lot of fun. And you made the race quite interesting, actually, for me. I'm not sure what it would have been like if you're just watching it, you know, as one normally does. So big thanks to them for that. We'll do the same thing in Hungary. If you haven't joined yet as a member, delighted to have you on board for that. It'll be a lot of fun. In the meantime, big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, to Track Ninja, and to REC Watches. See you soon. I think I'm doing a cam chat tomorrow and try and do a live stream before Hungary. See you very soon.